Introduction to Digital Terrain Modeling. So what is digital terrain modeling? Digital terrain modeling, or DTM, its abbreviation, is a term used to describe a mathematical representation of a continuous surface of the ground using x, y, and z coordinates. So imagine building a model of the ground using chipboard. So we're just going to replace the word digital with analog. So this is an analog terrain model. Each sheet represents an elevation. So we cut out, kind of trace the contours with our X-Acto knife and kind of cut out the contours. So each layer kind of represents an elevation, say maybe 1 foot. If we glue enough of these 1 foot layers or chipboard sheets together, we have a terrain representing our site. Now let us imagine, instead of building this ground surface with chipboard, we do it with the computer digitally. So instead of sheets of chipboard, we have points. So we're going to do this in the computer, and everywhere where you see these lines connecting, so kind of at the intersections, imagine that there is a point there, and each of those points represents an elevation with a unique XY coordinate. So each of these has a Z elevation value. And then we use these points as our basic building block to build our terrain. And then we connect each of these points with lines, as we can see here in this image, and then we shade in the area that it creates to create a surface. So all of these triangles now represent the ground or our surface. So again, the definition of a digital terrain model. This is a term used to describe a mathematical representation of a continuous surface of the ground using x, y, and z coordinates. You may come across other terms that are used to describe digital terrain models and are often used synonymously, but they are actually used to refer to very different or certain types of end products. So I have kind of an example. I tried to create an elevation, and this is just an image from Google Earth, so it's not super high resolution. And this is actually a view kind of out from the front side of my house looking out to a lake. So there's a lake back here in the background. So when you go out to collect data, the very first type of surface that ends up getting created is something called a DSM, or a digital surface model. So we often call it a DSM because it's a lot easier and shorter than saying digital surface model each time. And what that is referring to, this is a term used to describe a very specific product, sometimes received directly after acquiring terrain data. So sometimes it may be referred to as a first return instead of saying DSM. And basically what that represents is this red line that is drawing across the screen here. So it represents the terrain surface, but anything that may be sitting on the terrain as well, such as trees, could be a house, and this electric pole is actually in the foreground, so I kind of ignored it. But let's just say that maybe we are interested just along this line here on the terrain and the things that are sitting on that line. So that would include these trees back here, and this garage here, and the pavement that's running across this road here. And then there are 4 other terms used to reference something a little bit different. And that is this yellow line that is across the screen here. And this yellow line represents the bare earth. So sometimes we call it the bare earth, or a DEM, a digital elevation model. So this is where we are removing all of the objects on the terrain, and we're only just concerned with just the earth. So that would include the building. This can be a little bit confusing because if you know anything about building or architecture, it also ignores the fact that there's a footing and possibly a basement underneath the structure. So it's just drawing that surface right on top of that, ignoring the fact that there might be a basement under this structure. So we see 4 terms here: DEM, DHM, DGM, and DTED. And chances are you may come across those terms. So let's figure out what a DEM is. This is short for Digital Elevation Model, and this is going to be the most common term that you're going to hear often. The word elevation emphasizes the measurement of height above a datum and the absolute altitude of elevation of a point in the model. So, for example, everything is measured off some datum value, which is basically elevation 0. So that's what the next sentence says. The datum is often elevation 0, and elevation 0 could be set at sea level or at some point in space. The points are those residing on the surface on the ground. So when you see a DEM and you see a bunch of elevation values, those elevation values are are along this yellow line here. Sometimes the term bare earth is used to reference this type. So again, you may hear the term bare earth, and what that is referring to is the points along this yellow line. The next one you might hear is called a DHM. This abbreviates Digital Height Model. It has the same meaning as DEM, as height and elevation mean the same thing here. DHM term originated in Germany, so if you're working in Germany or in Europe, they may not use the word DEM, they may use the word DHM. Then we have DGM, and this stands for Digital Ground Model, and it somewhat means the same thing as DEM and DHM. You won't hear this term used too much. And then there's DTED, and this term is used by the U.S. Defense Mapping Agency, and it describes data produced by the same process as mentioned to the left, the DEM, DHM, and DGM, but it specifically uses grid-based data, so it's a little bit different in reading. And again, we'll rarely ever see that type. We'll mostly see DSMs and DEMs, and if we see DSMs, you'll often hear it referred to as a first return instead of a DSM. Hardly anybody uses that term anymore.